This book that I'm referring to, it was too pretentious. It was inaccessible. It was like they had a thesaurus open up while they were writing it to use the biggest words they could think of.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corene from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Keep It Fictional, a book podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. I'm glad to be back after a long hiatus from Keep It Fictional, and I'm joined today by my book friends Virginia and Corene. So today's theme is one that I have kind of complex feelings about. I've noticed that I have a pattern of choosing themes that challenge me to read books that I wouldn't typically read, which at the time sounds like it could be fun. But when I actually get around to having to read these books that I've chosen, I often end up dreading every choice that I've ever made. So that is what happened with this week's episode. A few weeks ago, I was trying to think of new themes for the podcast, and a colleague at the library named Sydney suggested that we read books from Booktok, so TikTok, but book reviews. And I don't personally use TikTok or take book recommendations from it because I don't trust other people, but it sounded like it could be fun to hate read something that is absurdly popular, something that I've always told myself I would never read just because other people read it. I do like to watch trashy reality TV for the joy of making fun of it, so that's kind of the vibe that I was going with for this topic. But what ended up happening is I couldn't decide which book to read because none of them sounded remotely interesting to me. Regardless, here we all are to talk about books that are popular on TikTok. Whether or not that means they're good is still up for debate. So I will go first because I kind of enjoyed my book, and I'm asking all of my book friends today whether or not they use TikTok or are active on Booktok or Bookstagram. And based on my little introduction, you can probably assume that I am not. I very briefly used TikTok. I decided it wasn't for me. I find a lot of the content on it quite irritating, and I find the people who are addicted to it quite irritating. So it's not my thing personally, and I apologize if anyone in the room does use TikTok. Not all TikTok people are like that. It's just not for me. I've decided it's not for me. But there are quite a few books that I would hear about through it that I'd be like, oh, that might be good. Most of the time, if I give it a shot, it's not actually something I've enjoyed, but I have enjoyed things that are popular on TikTok before. I really liked Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I really liked This Is How You Lose the Time War. So not every TikTok book is bad. And that's kind of why we're here today, is to share some of them. So when I first was looking for a book to read today, I chose one that I actually had initially heard about on TikTok, but had a glowing recommendation from a close friend of mine whose taste that I really trust. So I was like, okay, I will give this one a shot since I'll probably like it. Turns out it was one of those books that I'd have to read at a very specific time in my life to enjoy. And now is not that time. None of the characters were likable, which would be okay if they were kind of redeemable in some way or they made the story more interesting. But I really couldn't find anything to grasp onto and to hook me into reading this book. I just hated everything that was happening with it, which isn't typical for me. I don't usually hate things that aggressively. So this was a new one for me. I got maybe about 20% of the way through it before I was like, nope, not for me. I detest these people too much, and I can't endorse any of their decisions. So this book that I'm referring to, it was too pretentious. It was inaccessible. It was like they had a thesaurus open up while they were writing it to use the biggest words they could think of. And it seemed void of morals. So I decided that when I really want to read something that'll piss me off, I might come back to this one. But for this episode today, I chose something that's a little bit more uplifting, that's a little bit more positive, and I needed something that I could read really fast. So my partner recommended I try a Taylor Jenkins Reid book, and I've never read her before, so I was like, cool, that's great. I know she's really popular on TikTok, so that would fit really perfectly. Every book that she writes blows up on the internet because they're like popcorn. They're just so easy to eat up. They're great vacation books, great books if you're in a reading slump. And since I like sports drama, we know this about me. I'm wearing my Haikyuu shirt today. I picked up the book Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this book opens up in 1994 with a tennis match. Nikki Chan is a fierce and brutal British tennis star, and she's facing off against a young up-and-comer named Ingrid Cortez. Carrie and her father are watching the match from the sidelines. well aware that all of the cameras and all the audience members are watching their reactions. If Nikki wins, she will have won 20 Grand Slam titles. So that's like Wimbledon, Australian Open, US Open, all those different tennis tournaments. And she will tie the world record that Carrie set back in 1987. So the outcome of this match will determine Carrie's legacy and whether or not she's truly retired from professional tennis for good. Nikki ends up claiming the victory, tying Carrie's record. And for Carrie, it looks like she's coming out of retirement and returning to the game to defend her 20 victory record. The book then flashes back to Carrie's childhood, and it details how her father raised her to be a tennis star. Carrie's father, named Javier, immigrated from the United States from Argentina when he was only 27. When he married Carrie's mother, a dance teacher, he knew that their child, with his power and her grace and agility, could be the greatest tennis player the world has ever seen. Carrie was indoctrinated into his world of tennis at a young age, and after her mother died tragically when she was a child, tennis became the single and most important thing that kept their family together. Her bond with her father is powerful. Their relationship was actually probably my favorite part of the book. As a working class immigrant who plays a rich person's sport, he instills within Carrie at a young age an us against the world kind of attitude. And Carrie is meant to be the best. She's meant to be ruthless and power hungry and to crush her opponents. And she really lives up to these expectations that her father has of her. As her tennis skills gradually improve, she becomes cold and unapproachable. She's determined that she doesn't need any friends to rise to the top. Carrie regularly insults the players that she scrimmages against, accusing them of being beneath her. And when asked what advice she has for players trying to keep up with her and her growing skills, she brashly says, honestly, get better at tennis. By her mid-teens, yeah, she's ruthless. By her mid-teens, Carrie has quit school to commit her time fully to playing tennis professionally. She finds an adversary in a girl named Paulina Stepanova, a 6 foot tall 18-year-old Russian player with arms like cannons and an aggressive attitude to rival Carrie's own. Over the next few years, Carrie dominates tennis tournaments around the world and gradually climbs up in the global rankings. She can beat anyone except for Paulina. And at the US Open in 1976, Carrie and Paulina finally meet in the finals. It's a close match, but Carrie is able to take the advantage of Paulina's weakness due to an ankle injury, and she ends up claiming the victory. Paulina collapses to the ground in tears at her defeat. In a post-match interview, a reporter asks Carrie if she feels guilty for taking advantage of Paulina's ankle, and Carrie leans into the mic and says, no. Her nickname from then on is the Battle Axe. Paulina ends up retiring shortly after this loss, and Carrie continues to dominate tennis tournaments for the next decade, living up to her reputation as being a cold-hearted, impenetrable machine. Her own injuries finally catch up to her, though, and after a few bad seasons and her fair share of tabloid scandals, Carrie retires from professional tennis at 1989. I think at this point she's in her early 30s. The book then jumps back to 1994, back to the present where it starts, and right after Nikki Chan beat Cortez and tied Carrie's record for the 20 Grand Slam victories. Carrie at this point is now 37, and despite being considered far too old to compete as a professional tennis player, she's determined to make her return and defend her world record. The legacy of her victories is all that matters to her, and the desire to defeat Nikki Chan is enough to convince her to make a comeback. She begins training again with her father for the first time since the early 80s when she fired him as her coach. And she has a long and arduous road ahead of her, but if anyone can achieve the impossible and win a Grand Slam in their late 30s, it's the Battle Axe. The latter half of the book then details Carrie's rigorous training schedule. It is a lot of tennis. It's a lot of tennis as she prepares to re-enter the competitive circuit, while simultaneously she's navigating the negative and misogynistic press route that she receives for daring to be a woman making a comeback and an outspoken and no-nonsense woman at that. She ends up reconnecting with a fling that she had back in the 80s, a male tennis player who is also attempting a comeback and who also has a iffy reputation. And the two of them kind of push each other to mature both as players and also as people. As Carrie re-enters the global competitions in 1995, she is finally and gradually becoming more comfortable with losing and has gained a newfound motivation for why she plays and for who she plays for. So this book was pretty good. If you like sports books, this book was pretty good. It definitely wasn't bad. I'm glad that I put down that first book and picked this one up because this one was much easier to get through. And I like sports drama. So the tenets of it all was actually kind of interesting to me. I enjoy that kind of stuff. I'm not a competitive person myself, but I enjoy reading about it in sports books. And I especially enjoy sports books that contextualize the sport and explain its basic rules without being too boring or like assuming that the readers don't have any knowledge at all. And I think this book does that really well. So if you don't know anything about tennis, I think you can still get into it if you like that kind of like competitive, edge of your seats drama story. When the book jumps back to Carrie's childhood, readers are learning the rules of tennis along with Carrie. Her dad is explaining it to her as he's teaching her, and it kind of works for understanding the sport better. While this book has a really fast paced plot, I did kind of find the writing style bland at times. It's very much like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And you don't get a lot of Carrie's internal dialogue or her internal thoughts, aside from the fact that she's extremely competitive and that she looks down on everybody else, which ends up leaving the characters a little bit flat. We only really get kind of a surface level understanding of their motivations. You get a little bit deeper later in the book, but at the beginning, it's definitely quite monotone. But the simplicity of the writing also makes the book really accessible. So I'd recommend it if you're in a reading slump or if you want something that doesn't really require a lot of effort to understand. It's quite matter of fact. You don't have to dig beneath the surface to really get into the plot. So it makes this book really, like, I'd call it compulsively readable. It's really easy to just pick up and blast through it. But for me personally, I prefer books that are a little bit more like philosophical and abstract. So I wouldn't always be drawn to this writing style myself. It doesn't require a lot of effort to read, though. So, like I said, if you're in a reading slump or like going on vacation, it would be a great book for that. And I can totally understand why both Carrie Soto and Taylor Jenkins Reid's other books are super popular with the masses because the plot moves super quickly, the language is really easy to read, and since you don't need to have prior tennis knowledge to understand it, it's the type of story that would be pretty easy for just anybody to get invested in. I did read some Goodreads reviews before jumping into it, and I usually don't let those deter me from whether or not I'm going to read a book because I tend to have different opinions than the people that review on Goodreads. But the majority of the criticism that I saw from it is people didn't like how much Spanish is incorporated in the dialogue. Since Carrie's father is Argentine, the two often speak Spanish together, but a lot of the time he speaks Spanish to her and then she answers in English. And I really like that. I think the inclusion of the Spanish fleshes out their characters and the code switching makes them more realistic and more interesting. But a lot of people on Goodreads found it to be a barrier to understanding, and they didn't like how often the Spanish was used and the fact that translations weren't given directly after it. I personally disagree with that. So I think the Spanish really made these characters relatable and much more realistic because they're Spanish speakers. So of course they're going to use it. So I wouldn't let those type of reviews deter you from reading it. I do think the book is still really easy to understand, even if you don't know any Spanish. They contextualize it really well. And Carrie usually kind of explains what her dad said in Spanish afterwards in English. So it's easy to understand. Don't listen to Goodreads. It was easy to understand. So I wouldn't let any sort of negative reviews like that deter you from picking up this book. I don't think I will read Taylor Jenkins Reid's other stuff after this just because it wasn't weird enough for me. It wasn't banana pants enough for me. But if you like her other books, or if you like sports drama, or if you're looking for something kind of quick and exciting, an easy summer read, then you should definitely check out Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid.
No, I'm going to pipe in with a defense for the masses.
What's your defense for the masses?
Said the masses with such a disdainful tone.
Did I? I didn't notice.
Gosh, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's not good.
That's true. I do like popular things. I like the Song of Achilles. That's another popular one.
Yeah, but I really enjoy books that kind of take you kind of like on the emotional journey, and they don't necessarily have to be kind of like, I know you and Virginia are like banana pants, but I'm like, no. I would love to just be able to follow what's going on, please. I would love this to be grounded in some sort of like emotion or reality that I can taste or touch. So that is very much my thing. And I really enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six, which is another Taylor Jenkins Reid. I think it was kind of like their breakout book. And if you are looking for something, I didn't see the miniseries, but if you are looking for something that's like a really fun, like Stevie Nicks tribute without kind of coming out and saying that it's Stevie Nicks, you will absolutely enjoy this. And it's written in a podcast format and interviews, which I thought was really interesting. So I think that Taylor Jenkins Reid is always doing something interesting, even though it's sometimes more matter of factual. But I think she's trying to do that to kind of like reflect the character. And the same thing that she does in Daisy Jones and the Six is that she's kind of doing that audio format of people kind of telling their stories in the same way that it kind of reflects like their songwriters and musicians. And so I think maybe she was kind of doing that to kind of show the character through the writing. So yeah, that's Corene's defense of the masses today.
No, I did enjoy this book. I did like it. It's just not something like if I was in a reading slump, something like this would be perfect, but it's not something that I am always drawn to because I prefer things that are a little bit weirder. And I like being taken on that like realistic emotional journey, but something that's a bit more introspective than just like plot. I like character-driven books, and this one is plot-driven, like purely plot-driven. But no, definitely not bad. I just don't know if I'll check out her other stuff after this. And I think this one's considered a part of like, there's like 4 historical women like sagas that she's done. There's Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones, Carrie Soto, and Malibu Rising, I think is the last one in there. So like, if you like any of those books, they're all kind of tied together. Taylor Jenkins Reid knows what she does well, and she does it well. Anyway, time for a vibe shift. Time for a very drastic vibe shift. We're going to switch over to Virginia and hear about the Booktok book she has to share. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I have to ask you if you use Booktok or Bookstagram and what your thoughts are on it.
So Emma, you're right. Don't worry about it. Yeah, no. The answer is no, as you probably know. Just like you, I agree with pretty much your intro of Booktok. But first of all, let me just say, as a librarian, anything that gets people reading is a good thing, right? Whatever it is that can turn people into readers, that get them interested in books, great. I appreciate it. Doesn't mean I have to like it personally. I appreciate it. That's my stance on Booktok and other things. And I think just like you, Emma, it's the same thing. Like, I'm stubborn that way. I tend to stay away from things that are popular. I don't believe that things that are popular, I have to get on that bandwagon. I don't always have to. I like to come to things on my own terms. So very often I end up doing or reading or watching something that is super popular, like years later when nobody talks about it. That's when I get into it because I don't care for the popularity of things anyway. So Booktok is one of those things that I'm like, yeah, it's not the kind of things that I want to be. And I think just like you, Emma, same thing. Like every time I look at those list of books that are trending on Booktok, or you go to the bookstore and they have a table of like, these are Booktok books. 90% of the books, they tend to be books that I would not read. They're just not my type of book. Again, there are going to be readers out there and they can read whatever they want. They're just not my type. So this makes this episode quite challenging. Emma, thanks for the episode. I should also thank Sydney for this. Sydney, come on. Right? It is Sydney's fault. Yes. So I was like, as per my usual, complaining to Mark about this. And he was just like, Osamu Dazai, which he knows I like, his popularity can partly be attributed to Booktok. And then, being the good librarian that he is, he proceeded to text me the New York Times article about Osamu Dazai and Booktok so that I have a source to cite in case I get questions about my book choice today. So yes, give New York Times that. And yes, there are many, many reasons why Osamu Dazai is popular. One of them could be Booktok, or at least to continue his popularity. Anyway, a couple of days after that, I saw another CBC thing about Kafka being the Booktok boyfriend. And I'm like, what the hell? And so I realized that I do have options. I have options for this episode. And in fact, I was actually hoping to talk about Kafka today because this year, 2024, is the 100th anniversary of his death. And so I was going to talk about that, but I didn't get a hold of the book, Letters to Milena. That's the one that made him the boyfriend status on Booktok. So I figured I didn't get a hold of that book. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll talk about Dazai instead. And today is appropriate because I know that both Corene and Emma, they have both read Dazai. I don't know how they feel about him or his works. So maybe afterwards we can talk about it. Like, what do you think makes him like an appealing author on Booktok? Because contrary to what Emma said earlier, not all Booktok books are bad. True, but also not all Booktok books are positive and compulsively readable. I would definitely not consider this to be that. So before I start, I just also want to give content warning for suicide, for attempted suicide, and many different forms of addiction in the following discussion. As Emma and many listeners know, I came to Dazai's work and I came to realize how I have a huge, huge, huge gap in my knowledge of Japanese literature because I tend to read more contemporary writers because of one manga and one anime. Is Bungo Stray Dogs. That's the reason why I read a lot of these authors. Very, very late to the party, I'm very ashamed to say. At some point, Emma and I are going to do a Bungo Stray Dog episode when Corene and Sadie are not here, but today is not one of them.
Shut up. I read it. I like it.
I know, but you're probably not obsessed like maybe some of us are. I don't know. Anyway.
You don't know my life.
I don't know your life, and that's okay. Anyway, so, like just to the relation between, I think, the manga and the real like authors are very, very like tenuous. Like, they basically share the same names, and their magical abilities in the show are based on their most famous work. And these are classic Japanese and some non-Japanese authors that are in there. And there's some other connections in there. For example, like in real life, there's a very reverse obsession between Akutagawa and Dazai. And, pitting Dostoevsky against Dazai is also a thing because Dazai, like, really quite, you can imagine from his work, really quite admire Dostoevsky's work. So anyway, so this show actually lead me to discover a lot of authors. I've talked about Akutagawa on the show, on the murder episode. I talked about Soseki when we did a free play episode with Liz and Sadie last December. And now it's Dazai. So like we're working on the list, Emma. And Corene, apparently. So next time, it's your turn to talk Chuya. So that's your assignment next time. So anyway, Osamu Dazai, born in 1909, probably most famous for two of his novels. Within Japan is probably The Setting Sun, a post-war novel, which I also read for this episode, just to see what other writing of his is like. And then, of course, No Longer Human, which is the one most popular outside of Japan and the one that is on Booktok. It is known as what classified in Japan as what they call the I novel, which is kind of a confessional type of novel. It's not quite an autobiography, but is, as the translator of the version that I pointed out, it's the author exposes himself most directly. They're not hiding anything that they've done, even if it makes them look bad. And it is not about plot. It's not about the character learning things. It's just about like what happened to them and sometimes what is the impact on them. And people who believe in this type of novel really think that this is the novel. This is what novel should be. Because No Longer Human is his I novel, there's a lot of events that occur in the story to the character Yozo is very similar to the events that occurred in Dazai's life, not completing his schooling, having alcohol and morphine addiction, involvement in the Communist Party, and his allowance being cut off by his family because his family is involved in politics, his many, many affairs with women, and also his multiple suicide attempts. All of those things happen also in Dazai's life. But not everything is based on his life and his own experience. And it makes it kind of hard to tell sometimes because as Yozo, the character, pointed out, sometimes when he's telling the truth, people don't believe him. But when he's making things up, then people take them as facts. So it's hard to tell, sort of separate facts from fiction in his books. Osamu Dazai is also a pseudonym. So he also created this kind of persona. And in 1948, he and his lover drowned themselves and committed suicide together. And their bodies were discovered on June 19, which would have been his 39th birthday. And the book was published after that. So it again adds to the difficulties in sort of separating like what is really his life and what is sort of the characters. No Longer Human is the book that Booktok is in love with, apparently. The Japanese name is Ringen Shikaku, which really literally translated more as a failed human being or a disqualified human being. And that really was what is the heart of the novel and the heart of Yozo Oba, the main character's problem and his deep, deep fear that he will never figure out what it means to be a human being, how to be one. It seems like everyone else knows how to act, how to behave. Everybody is going to pass as a human being except him. And human behavior just doesn't make sense to him, especially in relation to other people. And he just doesn't know how to act around other people. And he feel like he's disqualified. He feel like he can never pass this test. And throughout his life, Yozo tries to indulge himself in many, many different things to try to draw attention away from himself, from the fact that he has this insecurity, this anxiety that he is not going to be a human being. And nothing has helped. Nothing has helped him. And he's deeply, deeply worried that people knows that whatever he does, they know that he's just acting, that people will see right through him. Whenever he catches glimpses of the purity of human being is, like they never seem to last for him, and it just dissipates so easily that he always ends up being disappointed. And then he goes back to all his vices because he just doesn't know how to cope. As a child, anxious about, again, not living up to those expectations of being a human being, he took up what he called clowning, basically making a laughing stock of himself, writing silly stories, turning them as homework, making all his classmates laugh, including his teachers, even though they chastised him, but making people laugh and try to, again, divert that attention that he really doesn't know how to act around people. As an adult, he took up alcohol, he took up drugs, he has multiple affairs with women. He uses the fact that people seem to feel bad for him to like get his way, to get money, to get drugs. He's involved in, like as I mentioned, in communist groups. Like he's trying to find out, how can I pass this test? How can I be a human being? And no matter what happens, at the back of his mind, he always thinks that he's going to fail. He's not gonna cut it. On Booktok, the one that I watched, apparently, according to the New York Times article, is one of like, I don't know, there's like 7,000 videos similar to this. It's basically like the image of his book cover, No Longer Human, or something flipping through the book. And you'll hear this sort of voiceover saying, like, tell me, Dazai, why is it that you wish to die? And then there'll be a reply saying, well, let's turn that question around. Is there really any value to this thing we call living? I first read the Donald Keene translation published by New Direction, which is the one that you will most likely see on Booktok. And I must say, I don't think I fully got the book. Like, I don't really fully understand. I think because some of the episodes in the character's life are quite unpleasant to read. And so it was hard for me to kind of really get like, well, what is the obsession about this, right? And then I read it again, and this time in the manga adaptation by Junji Ito. I don't think there's anybody who's better to adapt that book than Junji Ito. And I think like many of his drawings, it's not something that you can unsee once you have seen them. Like it's stuck in my brain. And I really do feel like I got a better sense of that fear, that anxiety that the main character is feeling. For this episode, I read the other translation published by Stonebridge Press by Mark Gibeau. And I really felt like I really got a lot more out of this book. As the translator pointed out, when you're translating a book, you are making thousands and thousands of decisions about what words to use based on what your interpretation and your understanding of the story when you read it. So I felt like I was more connected to the book, probably because I was also dying from a migraine. I think that might have something to do with it. So I was like really in the right mindset to read it, I think, maybe. I don't know. But I just really felt like I've connected with the characters and everything that I was saying. I think for me, it's his keen observations about like his fellow human beings. He really able to distill them. Like he was talking about, like, for example, Yojo's friend, Horiki's, his ability to ignore like opinions of people, so that when you talk to him or when you like hang out with him, you're never in danger of an awkward silences because he never like cares about what the listener is thinking. It's like little stuff like that. It's one of those books you probably like highlight the heck out of because there's just so many lines and so many things at the right time. They can really, really speak to you. And that desperation in Dazai, you can see that even though he sees to himself not being qualified as a human being, he sees himself apart from everybody else, that he just doesn't fit in. But yet there's that connection that he really yearns for. Why is he going viral? I don't know. I don't know why he fits into this whole Booktok business. Some people say that it's because that pressure that we all feel needing to perform for others, to have this public image of who you are, and that pressure. And the article talks about how he's basically a cult hero that channels the pain. And Patti Smith, I kind of quite like what she said, that Dazai wrote at the pace of a dying man, yearning for the solution to an unresolved equation.
which I feel like it really a good way to summarize maybe what his appeal is. I don't know. I mean, I like it. I enjoyed his work. I think some of his other works are quite different. And so if you want to get sort of maybe a more comprehensive sense of who Dazai is, I think check out some of his other books. And many of them are coming out, being released. Earlier this year, there's one, Self-Portraits, and then later this year, there's another one coming out. So, like I think his books are getting for all the reasons, he's getting publication in North America and in outside of Japan, which is great because, I think you really do get a very different sense of some of his works. And I think sometimes his very self-deprecation, that the humor also shows through in some of his other works, which I also quite enjoy. So yeah, not a happy book at all, not a easy to read book at all, but somehow it made it to TikTok. And so yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, No Longer Human, Osamu Dazai. So yeah, I'd love to hear from my book friends how they feel about his stuff.
Yeah. So the popularity of this particular book, I don't actually trace from predating Booktok. It comes from K-pop. It was kind of championed or kind of taken up by a lot of Korean idols. So they were seen reading it or they recommended it. And so they kind of recommended it to their fans. And so it was a very popular book to kind of be seen reading. It was a very popular book to kind of like discuss because K-pop fans often get book recommendations or stuff like that from their idols. And so that's actually how I encountered the book in the beginning. And this author, in many ways, really shocked that it's popular on Booktok because it's such a, oh man, it's such a difficult book to read through because you really just want to take him by the shoulders and just shake him. Yeah, so it honestly really does surprise me that it's popular on Booktok. Like I know why it's popular for like K-pop fans, but that is a shocking piece of news to me. But I think maybe some of the popularity is like I find his as you kind of mentioned, that self-depreciating humor very funny. And he has a wonderful way of words and making like this very like wry social commentary, and the way he kind of like cuts down and characterizes his friends, like distills them into these two little sentences that kind of just like picks them apart, but them instantly inside out. I find really interesting. Like he's a very incisive writer. And so I think that's really appealing because as you said, like you can flip to any page in there and find a line of it that resonates so much that I can see why he's popular that way. I would agree that I don't think it's his most accessible work. I found The Setting Sun really interesting because he's writing about like a very particular time in Japanese history and kind of like that lost generation after the war, and that really interested me because he's such an interesting like social commentator and willing to go to like really dark, ugly places and really bring them out and expose them for kind of like the hypocrisy that they are. I thought that was maybe like a stronger book or more interesting to me because this one really is like the descent of him into some really dark places, and he just kind of shrugs and says, well, that's what I am. So yeah, thank you for bringing this one to the podcast. I love that you like brought evidence to back it up that it is a Booktok book, because that honestly is the most shocking piece of information that I'm going to carry out today.
I knew that it was a Booktok book because for the brief like 2-3 months that I was on Booktok, I saw it. My reasoning for why I think it's popular on Booktok is very much based on my interest, like how Corene thinks it's popular because of K-pop. So like when the very brief time that I was on TikTok, it like instantly figured out that two important things about me, that I am gay and that I like anime. So pretty much my entire TikTok feed was queer content and anime content. And that's why I watched Bungo Stray Dogs, is because it was a show that kept popping up on my feed. And I was like, oh, this looks really fun. I'll check this one out. So I watched Bungo Stray Dogs, and I had never heard of Dazai before. But I think I was like curious about something about the characters. So I just Googled Osamu Dazai like an idiot. And all of a sudden I realized like, oh, this is a real person. No Longer Human is a book that he wrote. And then I started seeing No Longer Human on my TikTok feed. And so I discovered it through TikTok, through Bungo Stray Dogs. And I think one of the reasons that it's really popular is, and this is a huge generalization, but a lot of people on the internet dare I say, a lot of people on the internet have mental illness and relate to things about mental illness, and they enjoy reading books about depression. I enjoy reading books that are really sad and really upsetting like that. And so I think No Longer Human is something that people who are really active on the internet, people who I describe as chronically online, I think it's something that they would connect with, that experience of mental illness, that experience of kind of self-reflection. But when I read the book, it's a weird book to say I enjoyed because it's not an enjoyable book to read, but I do feel like I really got something out of it. I do feel like I really liked it when I read it, but as we all know, I like to read really depressing things. I like to read things with that kind of content. But I also read it, like I read it in the wintertime when I was living alone and I was in school. So I would like ignore my schoolwork and read No Longer Human, like under a cover of blankets and with my cat on my lap. So it was one of those, like I read it at the right time. I don't think I would be able to read it if I had a migraine because that would be way too much for my brain to take in at once. But when I have a migraine, I need to like watch Haikyuu or like just do something that'll just make me happy, make me feel good about myself. But yeah, so for this book, like I did really like it, but it's not something that I would recommend to everybody because of the weight of the content that it has. I've never read The Setting Sun, but I should, apparently, because I liked his writing style. I really enjoyed it. I like Japanese literature. I like things that are really sad and upsetting. So I think I would enjoy his other stuff. And like Corene said, Virginia, I appreciate you bringing this to us because although I knew that it was popular on Booktok, it's nice to like talk about things that are popular on Booktok, not just because they're accessible and they read like popcorn, like things that are popular for all of these other reasons and exposing our readers to things they might not typically have heard of or might not typically be drawn to. So let's cleanse ourselves of that sadness and we can go to our existential question for today. And this question requires a little bit of context. So a friend of mine from undergrad works at a literary center in Minneapolis, and she recently had the absolute pleasure of meeting Roxane Gay at a work event. I'm very jealous. My sister's also met Roxane Gay through work, and I can't believe it's happened twice in my life. And my friend and Roxane got into a conversation about reading guilty pleasures. Apparently, both of them enjoy hate reading Colleen Hoover books, who I would consider is the darling of TikTok, the darling of Booktok. So my question for my book friends today is, do you guys hate read? Who do you hate read? Would you hate read? Would you read a book by an author that you know you won't like or about characters that you absolutely cannot stand?
I can answer first. My answer is never, never. I do not ever. No, not even like just the one. Like no, like why are we torturing ourselves? Life is short. Life is like precious. I have so many books that I much rather read. So why would you torture yourself like that? So no, never.
This is kind of like a tricky question for me because as listeners of this podcast know, I always finish books, even if I'm not enjoying them and even if I hate them. It is a compulsion. Once I start it, I'm going to finish it, even if I am not enjoying it in any way. So kind of the answer to that is yes, because even if I hate the book, and there have been some books that I have truly hated, I power through to the end and usually am in dialogue with the author, even though they don't even know it. I'm sitting there reading the book and being like, well, that was a stupid choice for you to make. Like, oh, what an interesting structure you have for that sentence. So I can absolutely see why there is some enjoyment with it. Like, and I get it, especially if you're reading books that you kind of find like the premise or the characters like inherently ridiculous. It's like how I watch bad movies. I love bad movies. I love the Fast and the Furious franchise. I think they're the greatest movies of all time. And in many ways, I'm not watching it because I think that they're great movies. I'm loving the experience of reading it because it evokes an emotion in me. And that emotion is like glee of like how stupid this is. And I'm just enjoying it. So I absolutely understand why they're reading Colleen Hoover because for, certain people, it just doesn't connect in a certain way. But they are getting kind of like this fun little glee of like, oh, that's so stupid. So I get it.
What I don't understand is my friend who had this conversation with Roxane Gay is in like a hate read book club with some of her coworkers where like they continue to hate read things. And I'm like, who's got that kind of time? Corene, you should join.
I'm so tempted. That sounds amazing.
I can ask my friend if they do Zoom meetings if you're interested in joining. But like, and because she offered that I could join. And I was like, respectfully, no, because I don't have that kind of time. I already have to read all these things for the podcast. And like, I love my book friends. You guys know this. But sometimes you look at the theme and you go, I don't want to read a book about that. But you have to, because you have to get it done by the recording day. And so there have been times where I've read things that I haven't liked. I was an English major. I was forced to read things that I didn't enjoy. But I am not like Corene, and that if I don't like it, I usually won't finish it. Just because, like Virginia said, who's got that kind of time? I prefer to read things that I enjoy. I don't often take recommendations from people. If they tell me I should absolutely read something, I'm like, I do, however, hate watch things. So like trashy movies, absolutely. I love Love Island. I love Love is Blind. I love these like really terrible, like straight people reality dating shows about the kinds of people that I would like, the kinds of people that would have bullied me in high school, the kinds of people I would absolutely never be friends with. Never be caught dead talking to. But for some reason, like watching stupid pop people on my TV brings me joy. So like I enjoy hate watching things like that for the glee of it. I don't know if I could hate read, but I will see. Because I said earlier that I'm not gonna, out of respect, I'm not gonna name that book that I was totally just trashing on earlier. But if I'm ever in the mood where I want to read something that will like truly and properly piss me off, then I might go back to it. But right now I need something kind of wholesome, something kind of uplifting, and something a little bit weird after the Taylor Jenkins Reid book. So I do not hate read, but I do hate watch is my answer.
Do you get joy out of hate reading? I guess that's my question, because I think I can totally see why you would watch something that is silly, because you get joy out of it because it's just, but do you get joy out of hate reading? Can you get joy? Because I would be so angry.
I haven't yet.
Oh, it's so enjoyable, especially when it's and some people don't believe in this genre, but like so bad it's good. And I think that for people who kind of do that, there's like this sweet spot of like you're just enjoying the sheer nonsense of it all, and you're like, wow, you really went there. You really did this. Someone allowed this to be published. Someone wrote this down on a piece of paper. Someone edited it. Someone published it. A tree died for this. That is really, really fun. In the same way that watching Con Air is really fun.
Oh, come on. Con Air is much better. How dare you? How dare you say that watching Con Air compared to Hey, I just find it like I don't know, maybe I don't know what it is, but like I think like reading a book that it's so painful. Reading a mediocre book is already painful, and then reading a book that is just like bad, I can't imagine. It would just be so painful. I don't know. And maybe I just haven't found that like the equivalent as the Con Air of books. I have to look for that. Okay. All right.
I did try to hate read something recently because it was a sapphic historical romance, and I was like, "Oh, this sounds fun. This sounds fluffy." But the writing was so bad. It was just like mediocre. It was amateur. It was supposed to be historical fiction, but there were like anachronisms everywhere. And I tried to hate read it. I think I got to page like 70, and then I was like, "This book is too bad. I can't. I need to read something good that's well written." But yeah, Virginia, if I ever find a book that I can properly hate read and finish, I will let you know. Because it hasn't happened yet. I think we are done with the existential question and time for our last book talk recommendation. Corene, what did you read last night?
Oh boy, we're about to go on a real tone shift. So the AO3 tags for this particular piece of fiction are Omegaverse, Fated Mates, Forced Proximity, Forced Marriage, Single Dads, Porn with Plot, Mating Bites, Fluffy and Angst, and Slow Burn. I kind of put this to Virginia because, again, as usual, I panic on a Thursday evening before I leave work. I grabbed 2 books. I held them in front of Virginia. I was like, okay, which one do I read? And she very helpfully pointed me towards this particular author who is very, very popular on Booktok. And I think kind of this is a bit of a departure for them. And this is an author that Liz has read before and I think talked about perhaps on the podcast. Nope. But she talked about it to us. And so I was like, let's give it a chance. And by gum, did I chortle through this entire book. I could not believe that I was reading this. So when I started talking about, I said AO3 tags. And if you know, you know. AO3 is the Archive of Our Own, and it is a fan fiction repository. And this book is 100% fan fiction trope driven in a shocking way. And it really shouldn't be, because this particular author came out of like the Star Wars Reylo fandom, and her first book, The Love Hypothesis, is essentially that with like the VIN numbers shaved off. And this one, she kind of tackles she tackles the Omegaverse and kind of goes there in a way that had me like, I almost wanted to wake up and like knock on my roommate's door and be like, guys, you're never going to believe this, in a book published by Berkeley, But I had to wait and kind of contain it all to myself. So this is the book Bride by Ali Hazelwood. Great cover. And yeah, it's about a vampire and a werewolf, and they fall in love. So our main character is Misery Lark, because of course it is. And, you know, she's always been like a fish out of water. She's always felt like on the outside. So I guess that has something in common with No Longer Human. She is the daughter of a high-ranking member of the Vampire, and let me be very specific, Vampire with a Y, Vampire Council. And there is like this tenuous piece between the humans and the werewolves and the vampires. And how they keep this kind of peace in place is through the use of collateral. So essentially, the humans, the vampires, the werewolves, they choose usually a child that is very precious to a high-ranking member of that particular society, and they send them into the enemy territory so that if anyone makes a move against them, they will kill the child and people will feel bad. I don't know. I don't think too hard about it. So Misery, when she was very young, she had a twin brother named Owen. Her papa vampire took a look at the both of them and said, well, Owen's smarter and has more political acumen, so I guess you're being collateral. And so she gets sent off to the human world to be their hostage. But of course, she is alone and discriminated against because she has pointy ears and sharp fangs and doesn't eat things and, you know, sucks blood, stuff like that. And she has such a bad time that the humans decide to kind of keep her occupied, is that they will get her a companion. So they trot over to your ye olde local orphanage, snatch up a little child named Serena, and kind of give her to the vampire to occupy her. And so this forms this beautiful sisterly bond between Misery. Sorry, just saying that word out loud, I realized how funny that is. Sorry. Read the entire thing and I know her name is Misery. It's just like, hey, Misery, how's it going? Like, you have to say that every day. Focus. Okay. So Serena and Misery form like this sisterly bond. And even when Misery is returned to the vampire world, she kind of doesn't fit in with them either because she spent too long amongst the humans. And so she decides to disguise herself, move back to the human world, and live with Serena. However, she is once again called to be the sacrifice for the vampire people. The werewolves want peace and they want an alliance. They're not interested in the collateral system anymore, and so they're kind of upping the ante in that they want a permanent alliance, an alliance that involves marriage. And this is the last time since the very disastrous last attempt to kind of have a vampire and a werewolf marry each other, which ended in kind of like a red wedding situation. But the vampires are going to need to give a bride, and Misery is going to be it. But however, to everyone's surprise, she readily agrees to it for her own reasons. Her best friend is now missing, and the only clue that she has is a name scrawled on a piece of paper, Moreland. That also happens to be the name of the alpha werewolf, kind of head boss werewolf, Lo Moreland. Tall and many muscles. And she believes that he has the clue that she needs to track down her best friend. As their marriage is performed and they are living together, forced in the same house together, they grow a little bit closer, and maybe she realizes that being a hostage is not so bad. Lo is different than what she thought he would be like. They make good partners, and they unite against greater forces, plotting against them. Oh, wow. Okay, so this has every trope, every fan fiction kind of like thing that you are looking for, the snappy dialogue, all of my little tags here, all the werewolves, all the vampires, all the nonsense. It's all there. It's all there. What really shocked me, because, like it's a romance book. You kind of expect certain things. Like if a lady is kind of like forced to be married to someone, like eventually she'll fall in love with him. That's just how it is. And they'll be like destined to be forever. It's totally fine. Is that the author kind of like dips both toes into the world of a megaverse. And here's where I'm going to have to do some explaining, because if you know, you know. If you don't know, you don't know. So this is kind of like a trope in fan fiction, like an entire world that kind of has its roots in Star Trek. So there's like the Vulcan mating ritual of Ponfar. And this kind of idea was pulled in from Buffy with like werewolves and stuff like that, and Harry Potter with like shifters and stuff like that. And then it all came together, this like beautiful stew of ridiculousness. And it's ridiculousness that I love, no judgment, into the supernatural Mpreg fandom. So what this is that there are werewolves, and every person has like an inner wolf, and there's like a dominance hierarchy involved. So there's like alphas, and then there's like they're very like strong and buff, and then there's like omegas who are kind of like caregivers and whatever, and then there are betas who are just there to take care of everyone. And there's all these like tropes that this particular genre has. So the idea of like mating bites, where you bite the one you love and that's love. Fated mates, where there's someone biologically out there destined to be your other half. And like this inner wolf that's really hard to contain. And like people go into heat. I'm not going to talk about that. And then there are some things about werewolf anatomy within this genre that she goes there for. And it's like 1:00 in the morning, and I'm like, this book is just a wild ride. And then I got to that part and I was like, oh my gosh. All I'm going to say is, again, if you know, I saw Liz this morning because she has read it, and we just kind of exchanged a look, and she was like, can you believe? And I was like, I can't believe that. I'm like, could you believe that? No, I can't believe that. So it was a real pride. I am shocked. It's always interesting seeing things like pulled from like the internet world and those of the chronically online, Emma, pulled into kind of mainstream. So for example, like 50 Shades of Grey coming from Twilight fan fiction, eventually becoming kind of like its own universe. A whole bunch of like the new adult stuff is based off of like Harry Styles fan fiction. Like it's always interesting to see how these very online niche things like slowly make their way into like mainstream media. And so this is kind of like the first time that I have seen that particular universe come out into a very, very popular book. Ali Hazelwood is, again, very, very popular in Booktok. I think her romance books kind of, and her popularity kind of stemmed from that. I'm not a Booktok person myself because I'm deeply afraid of TikTok. My first exposure to it was someone kind of like with the little white text dialogue telling about like the most horrible things that had happened to them in their lives, deeply traumatizing, horrible things, as they were doing like this little like sad, slow, sexy dance. And I was like, oh, this is not for me. But I'm always like curious if a book gets really popular on Booktok or very popular on the internet. My first reaction is just like curiosity. I was like, oh, like why this book? Why this book? Why this author? Why not maybe other people that, in my opinion, do it better or well? Like especially like in the romance genre, there's some books that have kind of gained popularity, but I was like, I don't think that's actually the best example of that genre or best example of that trope. So I'm always like very curious as to why a particular book gets picked up and gets popular. But for this one, I 100% understand. She's a very, very competent writer. Like you enjoy the characters. Everyone is snappy. Everyone is sarcastic. Everyone's got a witty one-liner to kind of throw off. Like the romance hits all the right places. Like, yeah, he's big, he's strong, he's buff. He's got like a child that he looks after. He has a pilot's license, whatever. Like it's all good. And so like, I really understand why she's quite popular. And as a reading experience, that is a night I will never forget. Never forget. Yeah. So thank you so much for choosing this topic, Emma. I was very concerned last night that I wouldn't find something that I really enjoyed. And this might be one of my favorite reading experiences of the year. So thank you so much.
I am honored. I'm glad that you had such a good time. because I saw the panic in real time yesterday afternoon where you were like, what's the theme tomorrow? What do I have to read? So I was a little worried, especially with the first book that you grabbed. I was like, I don't know if you're gonna be able to read it in one night and if it's gonna be fun and if you're gonna enjoy yourself. But no, you seem so thrilled about the choices that you've made. So I'm happy for you. And that brings us to the end. I hope that our listeners were at least able to get some recommendation from what we talked about. We have 3 vastly different Booktok books. So now you can see just the sheer range of different things that become popular on Booktok. It's not just because they're compulsively readable. It's not just because they tap into the Omegaverse and all the fandoms. And it's also not just because they're super depressing. There are so many reasons that a Booktok book becomes a Booktok book. And I hope that you're at least able to get something new to read out of the 3 that we've shared or the other authors that were mentioned in this episode today. And with that, we say goodbye, and we will see you next week for more Keep It Fictional.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.